You need to move along, buddy. This entrance is for VIP guests only. The security coordinator's voice carried that particular brand of authority that comes from a clipboard and a temporary badge. She blocked the marble steps of the Metropolitan Museum's East Wing, her eyes scanning Damon Clark's black uniform with undisguised disdain. "I'm working security for tonight's event," Damon replied evenly, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone who'd had this conversation before. "Security staff uses the service entrance." Around back, she waved dismissively toward the shadows between buildings. "And next time, try to look more professional. This is a $2,000 plate charity gala, not a mall food court." The twist that would shatter everyone's assumptions was already in motion, though none of them knew it yet. In 6 hours, Damon would take the stage, not as hired help, but as the anonymous philanthropist who'd been funding the Children's Medical Research Foundation for 7 years. The same foundation, whose gala he was now being barred from entering through the front door of his own donated venue. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd personally written the check that paid for the flowers being arranged behind those glass doors, yet he was being directed to the service entrance like unwanted cargo. But that revelation would come later, after the evening's real drama unfolded. After board member Victoria Ashford's public humiliation, campaign against him escalated beyond mere classist dismissal into something far more sinister. After the foundation's financial crisis reached its breaking point and desperate measures were taken. After the truth about the missing donation funds came to light, and Damon found himself not just defending his right to be there, but fighting to save an organization he'd built from the ground up while remaining invisible. The confrontation brewing between him and Victoria had roots that ran deeper than tonight's gala. She'd been systematically undermining the foundation's work for months, redirecting funds meant for research into administrative costs and personal expenses. Her vendetta against the anonymous donor, against him, had become personal when he'd started asking questions through intermediaries. She didn't know who he was, but she knew someone was watching, someone with enough influence to threaten her. Carefully constructed financial house of cards, tonight's security assignment wasn't coincidence. Damon had orchestrated it to gather evidence, to document the financial irregularities firsthand. What he hadn't anticipated was how the evening would expose not just Victoria's corruption, but the systemic prejudice that allowed someone like her to operate with impunity, while someone like him was assumed to be a threat simply for existing. In the wrong uniform, the revelation would come in stages first. The discovery of the doctored financial records hidden in Victoria's private office. Then, the confrontation when she realized he'd been inside the foundation's systems for months, tracking every misappropriated dollar. Finally, the moment when she'd pushed too far, making accusations that would force him to reveal his identity. To protect not just himself, but the organization he'd spent years building, the security guard who'd been dismissed at the door would emerge as the foundation's largest benefactor, the quiet force behind every major medical breakthrough they'd funded. But before that vindication came, the night of being treated like a criminal in his own building, of watching Victoria parade around in a dress that cost more than most people's annual salary, while claiming poverty when it came to actually funding research. "Sir," I said, "move along." The coordinator's voice had sharpened, and to actual security guards, the kind hired from muscle rather than observation, had appeared at her shoulders. Damon looked up at the building where his name was engraved, in discreet letters on a donor plaque hidden behind a pillar in the main lobby, where his anonymous donations had funded 3 separate wings and countless research initiatives, where tonight he'd planned to quietly observe the organization he'd built being celebrated by people who'd never acknowledge his existence. "Use the service entrance," he said quietly, stepping back from the marble steps. "But you might want to check your guest list more carefully tonight. You never know who might be more important than they appear." The coordinator laughed, a sound that would haunt her when she learned the truth. "Right? I'm sure you're secretly a millionaire, just slumming it in security work." If only she knew it was billions, not millions. If only she knew that her dismissive treatment of him was being recorded by the small camera clipped to his uniform that would later become part of a larger investigation into the foundation's leadership. If only she knew that the service entrance she'd directed him to led to the private elevator that went directly to the penthouse office where the real donor meetings took place, but those revelations were still hours away. First, Damon had to survive an evening of being invisible in plain sight, of gathering evidence while being treated like a threat, of watching the organization he'd built being celebrated while the people celebrating it went out of their way. To ensure he knew he didn't belong, the real crime wasn't Victoria's embezzlement, though that was serious enough. It was the systematic dismissal of someone's worth based on nothing, more than the color of their uniform and the assumptions that came with it. The tragedy wasn't the money being stolen. Damon had enough to absorb those losses without blinking. It was the research being delayed, the children whose treatments were being postponed, the medical breakthroughs being shelved because someone had decided that personal enrichment mattered more than saving lives. By morning, the power dynamics would be completely reversed. Victoria would be facing criminal charges. The foundation would have new leadership, and Damon would finally step out of the shadows, not by choice, but because remaining hidden had become impossible when the organization he'd built was being destroyed from within. But that was still hours away. For now, he walked around to the service entrance, his footsteps echoing in the alley where Manhattan's elite preferred their help to remain unseen. The same alley where, before dawn, he'd be meeting with federal investigators who'd been tracking Victoria's financial irregularities for months. The irony would be complete when they realized that their star witness, the anonymous donor who'd been feeding them information, was the same man they'd watched being dismissed from the front. Steps like common trash. The service elevator opened directly into the museum's preparation area, where tonight's centerpiece waited under protective cloth. Damon's breath caught as he pulled back the covering, revealing the scale model of the Children's Medical Research Foundation's new facility, gleaming architectural marvel that would house the most advanced pediatric research labs in the world. Impressive, isn't it? Victoria Ashford's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent decades perfecting her public persona. She emerged from the shadows near the display, her emerald gown catching the spotlight aimed at the model. I suppose it's just another building to someone in your position. Damon's jaw tightened. She had no idea she was speaking to the man who'd spent 6 months working with architects to design every detail of that building. Every lab, every research station, every comfort area for families waiting for news about their children. Personally approved it all. It's beautiful, he replied, his voice carefully neutral. The foundation must be proud. Oh, we are. Victoria's smile had sharp edges. Of course, beautiful buildings require beautiful funding. Not everyone understands the complexities of managing charitable resources. She moved closer to the model, her fingers tracing the miniature building's walls. Some donors think they can just throw money at problems and expect miracles. They don't understand that real change requires experienced leadership. The accusation was barely veiled. For months, Victoria had been publicly questioning the foundation's anonymous benefactor, suggesting that their donations came with unreasonable demands and oversight requirements. She'd positioned herself as the voice of reason, protecting the foundation from an overbearing donor who didn't understand how real charity worked. What she didn't know was that Damon had been recording every board meeting through carefully placed allies, documenting her systematic dismantling of the foundation's mission. The unreasonable demands she complained about were actually basic financial accountability measures, then disappearing into administrative black holes. I'm sure the donor just wants to make sure the money is being used effectively, Damon offered, watching her reaction carefully. Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. Effectively, do you know what our mysterious benefactor's latest demand was? A full audit of all expenditures over the past 2 years, as if we haven't been transparent from the beginning. She gestured dismissively at the model. Some people think money gives them the right to micromanage everything. The irony was suffocating. Damon had requested the audit because Victoria's transparency consisted of quarterly reports that somehow never mentioned the $2.3 million in administrative costs that had been reclassified from research funding. The micromanagement she complained about was actually his desperate attempt to save an organization that was being hollowed out from within. Perhaps the donor has concerns about specific expenditures, Damon suggested, his voice carefully measured. Victoria's eyes narrowed. You seem awfully interested in foundation business for someone who's supposed to be watching for pickpockets. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Are you sure you're just security? because you're asking very specific questions about very sensitive matters. The moment crystallized everything that would explode later in the evening. Victoria wasn't just embezzling funds, she was paranoid about being discovered, suspicious of everyone who showed too much interest in the foundation's operations. Her corruption had made her see enemies everywhere, including in the security guard, who was asking perfectly reasonable questions about the organization being celebrated. "I'm just curious," Damon replied. "It's an impressive facility. The children, who will benefit from it, are lucky to have such dedicated advocates." "Yes, well, dedication requires resources." Victoria's voice had hardened. "Resources that our anonymous friend seems to think grow on trees. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to run a world-class research foundation? The salaries alone for our top scientists." She trailed off, but Damon knew the rest. The top scientists she was referring to had been laid off 6 months ago, when the foundation claimed budget shortfalls, the same budget shortfalls that had occurred while Victoria was approving 6-figure consulting fees for her personal friends and family members. "I'm sure the donor understands the challenges," Damon said. "After all, they've been supporting the foundation for years. They must believe in its mission." Victoria's smile became predatory. "Belief is one thing. Understanding is another. Some people think charity should be simple, write a check and walk away. They don't appreciate the sophisticated management required to turn good intentions into real results." The sophisticated management she was referring to had turned a foundation with a 95% direct-to-research funding ratio into an organization that now spent more on administrative costs than on actual medical research. The real results were research, projects being canceled, promising treatments being shelved, and children's lives being put at risk, while Victoria redirected funds to pad her own lifestyle. "The donor might be more understanding if they could see the foundation's work up close," Damon suggested. "Maybe they'd appreciate the complexities you're dealing with." Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Oh, I'm sure they think they would, but some people prefer to remain in the shadows, making demands without taking responsibility. It's easier to criticize from a distance than to do the actual work." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Damon had remained anonymous, partly to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation, but also because he'd believed that good work could speak for itself. He'd trusted the foundation's leadership to use his donations responsibly, to maintain the organization's mission without his direct involvement. That trust had been systematically betrayed, and now he was facing the consequences of his own naivety. By trying to avoid the spotlight, he'd created a vacuum that Victoria had filled with her own agenda. By trusting others to protect the foundation's mission, he'd allowed that mission to be corrupted beyond recognition. "Maybe the donor is planning to step forward," Damon said carefully. "Maybe they're tired of working from the shadows." Victoria's expression shifted, suspicion replacing her practiced warmth. "Are you suggesting you know something about our benefactor? Because if you do, I'd be very interested to hear it." The question hung in the air like a threat. Victoria wasn't just curious, she was desperate to identify the anonymous donor so she could neutralize them. Her corruption had made her paranoid, but it had also made her dangerous. She'd already destroyed careers and redirected millions in funding. What would she do to protect her position if she discovered that the security guard asking uncomfortable questions was actually the person she'd been fighting against for months? "I don't know anything specific," Damon replied, stepping back from the model. "I just think it would be interesting if they showed up tonight. Imagine the surprise." Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. "It would be more than surprising. It would be ... illuminating. Some people think they can hide behind anonymity forever, but eventually, everyone has to face the consequences of their actions." The threat was clear, even if Victoria didn't know she was making it to the very person she was threatening. But Damon was beginning to realize that anonymity wasn't protecting him anymore, it was protecting her. As long as she could paint him as a faceless outsider making unreasonable demands, she could continue her systematic destruction of everything he'd worked to build. The revelation would come soon enough. But first, he had to survive an evening of being treated like a criminal while watching the organization he'd built being celebrated by the very people who were destroying it. The museum's main hall transformed as guests began arriving, their jewels catching the light from crystal chandeliers. that Damon had personally approved for the venue renovation. He positioned himself near the silent auction tables, watching familiar faces enter faces he'd seen in foundation reports, board meeting photos, and financial documents that told a very different story than the one being celebrated tonight. "Could you move out of the way, please?" A woman in a silver gown brushed past him without making eye contact, her dismissive gesture treating him like furniture. Behind her, a man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo made a show of stepping around Damon, as if he were an obstacle. "Security should be less visible," the man muttered to his companion, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never questioned his own importance. "It's like having servants standing around at a dinner party." Damon had met this particular guest before, though the man wouldn't remember. Thomas Whitmore, whose pharmaceutical company had received a $15 million research grant from the foundation, a grant that had been approved by Victoria despite the company's poor track record and Thomas's personal friendship with her. The research had produced nothing but quarterly reports, filled with technical jargon and promises of breakthrough developments that never materialized. "Excuse me," another voice, this one sharp with authority. Damon turned to find a woman in foundation management approaching, her expression pinched with annoyance. "You're blocking the auction display. These items are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." The items in question were indeed valuable, a collection of artwork and jewelry donated by the foundation's supporters. What the guests didn't know was that several pieces had been purchased by the foundation itself using donor money, then donated back to create the illusion of broad support while actually functioning as a money laundering operation. "I'll move," Damon said quietly, stepping away from the display case, "and try to look less intense," the woman added. "You're making some of our guests uncomfortable." Damon almost laughed. His presence made them uncomfortable because it reminded them that the help was watching, that someone was paying attention to who was saying what and doing what. If they only knew that the help was actually the person funding their elaborate evening, their discomfort would transform into something approaching terror. Victoria's voice cut through the crowd as she began her opening remarks, her words carrying to every corner of the marble hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to an evening dedicated to the future of children's medical research. Tonight, we celebrate not just the work we've accomplished, but the work that lies ahead." The irony was staggering. The work that lay ahead had been systematically defunded by Victoria's creative accounting. Research projects that could have saved lives had been shelved to pay for tonight's catered champagne and orchestra. The future she was celebrating was built on the sacrifice of the present, on the cynical calculation that public relations mattered more than actual results. "Our foundation has achieved remarkable things," Victoria continued, her voice swelling with practiced emotion. "But we couldn't have done it without the generous support of donors who believe in our mission." Damon watched the crowd's reaction. Applause, interested murmurs, the satisfied expressions of people who felt good about their charitable giving. They had no idea that their donations were being systematically diverted, that the research they thought they were funding existed more on paper than in reality. Of course, not all donors understand the complexities of medical research. Victoria's voice took on a subtle edge. Some expect immediate results, simple solutions to complex problems. They don't appreciate the sophisticated management required to turn good intentions into scientific breakthroughs. The criticism was aimed directly at him, though she still didn't know he was standing 20 feet away. She was using the gala as a platform to build public support for her position, painting the anonymous donor as unreasonable and demanding, while positioning herself as the voice of expertise and restraint. "That's why leadership matters," Victoria continued. "That's why we need people who understand that real change requires patience, wisdom, and yes, sometimes difficult decisions about resource allocation." The difficult decisions she was referring to included cutting research funding by 60% while increasing administrative costs by 400%. The resource allocation had prioritized her personal comfort over children's lives, a calculation that would have been indefensible if anyone had been paying attention to the actual numbers. A hand touched Damon's arm. He turned to find Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the foundation's former researchers who'd been laid off in Victoria's restructuring. She was dressed in a simple black dress that probably represented a significant expense for someone now working at a community clinic. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said quietly. I'm working security, Damon replied, grateful for a friendly face in the crowd of people who'd been treating him like he was invisible. Security. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. That's interesting, I would have thought. She paused, studying his face. You know, you look familiar. Have we met before? The question sent a chill down Damon's spine. Dr. Chen had been one of the Foundation's most promising researchers, working on treatments for childhood leukemia that had shown remarkable progress before her project was canceled. She'd also been present at several donor meetings where Damon had participated by video conference. His face partially obscured, but potentially recognizable. I don't think so, Damon said carefully. I would have remembered meeting a doctor. Dr. Chen's expression remained puzzled. It's strange. I could have sworn... She shook her head. Anyway, it's nice to see a friendly face. This crowd isn't exactly welcoming to people like us. People like us. People who actually care about the work more than the publicity. Do you know what Victoria said when she fired me? That my research was too narrowly focused to attract broad donor support? Apparently, curing childhood leukemia isn't glamorous enough for the Foundation's new direction. The confession hit Damon like a physical blow. He'd specifically funded Dr. Chen's research because of its promise, had personally approved the multi-year grant that was supposed to support her work through clinical trials. Victoria had not only canceled the research, she'd lied about the reasons, claiming budget constraints, while actually redirecting the funding to her own priorities. I'm sorry, Damon said, meaning it more than Dr. Chen could possibly know. That must have been devastating. It was, Dr. Chen admitted, but what really hurts is knowing that the children who could have benefited from that research are still waiting. Some of them don't have time to wait for the Foundation to get its priorities straight. Victoria's voice continued to fill the hall, describing the Foundation's bright future and ambitious plans. But Damon was seeing the real cost of her ambition. Brilliant researcher standing beside him, forced to work in an underfunded community clinic because her life-saving work wasn't profitable enough for Victoria's new vision. Dr. Chen, Damon said carefully, what would you do if you had the resources to continue your research? Her eyes lit up with a passion that Victoria's corruption hadn't been able to extinguish. I'd finished the clinical trials. We were so close to a breakthrough, a treatment that could improve survival rates by 40%. But that takes time, patience, and sustained funding. Things that are apparently out of fashion these days. And if someone were to provide that funding, Damon asked, hypothetically, Dr. Chen's expression became intense. I'd work day and night. I'd recruit the best team I could find. I'd make sure every dollar went directly to research, not administrative overhead. She paused, studying his face again. Why do you ask? Do you know someone who might be interested? The question hung in the air as Victoria's speech reached its climax, her voice soaring with false emotion about the Foundation's commitment to excellence and accountability. The same accountability she'd been systematically undermining for months. The same excellence she'd sacrificed for personal gain. I might, Damon said quietly. I might know someone who's very interested in making sure the right work gets done. Dr. Chen's eyes widened. Are you serious? Because if you are, I have detailed proposals, budget projections, everything needed to restart the research immediately. I'm serious, Damon replied. But first, I need to deal with some administrative issues. The administrative issues in question were currently taking their final bow on the museum's stage, accepting applause for work they'd actively sabotaged. But the applause would turn to something very different when the truth came out. Financial records were revealed when the canceled research projects were exposed, when the real cost of Victoria's leadership became clear. You know, Dr. Chen said thoughtfully, you really do look familiar. Are you sure we haven't met? Sure, Damon lied. But I have a feeling we'll be working together soon. Very soon. If everything went according to plan, the evidence was already compiled, the investigators were already involved, and the Foundation's board was about to learn exactly who their anonymous benefactor had been all along. The confrontation began during the desert course, when Victoria's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She'd been watching Damon throughout the evening, her paranoia growing with each interaction she observed between him and the guests. When she saw him speaking quietly with Dr. Chen, her suspicion crystallized into certainty. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria's voice cut through the dinner conversation like a blade. I need to address a security concern." The room fell silent, crystal glasses pausing midway to lips, conversations stopping mid-sentence. All eyes turned to Victoria, who stood at the head table with the bearing of someone delivering a pronouncement from on high. "We have reason to believe that our anonymous benefactor has sent a spy to tonight's event." Victoria continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Someone who has been asking inappropriate questions about foundation finances and attempting to gather sensitive information." Damon felt every eye in the room turn to him, the weight of their collective gaze like a physical force. He'd been expecting this moment, had prepared for it, but the reality was still breathtaking in its audacity. Victoria was using the gala itself as a stage for her accusations, turning the Foundation's most prestigious event into a public trial. "Our security consultant has been observed questioning multiple guests about Foundation operations." Victoria's voice grew stronger, feeding on the shocked attention of her audience. "This behavior is not only inappropriate, but potentially illegal. Corporate espionage is a serious crime." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Damon could see the guests' expressions shifting from confusion to suspicion to outright hostility. In their world, the help didn't ask questions about business. Security guards didn't engage in conversations about Foundation finances. His very presence had been threatening from the moment he'd entered the building, and now Victoria was giving them permission to act on that threat. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Damon said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "I was hired to provide security for tonight's event. Any conversations I had with guests were in the course of my duties." Victoria's smile was triumphant. "Your duties? And what exactly did those duties include?" "Interrogating Dr. Chen about her research funding, asking detailed questions about our procurement processes, demanding to know about our donor relationships." Each. The accusation was technically true, but completely misrepresented. Damon had asked about Dr. Chen's research because he'd funded it. He'd inquired about procurement because he'd been tracking the misappropriation of funds. He'd been interested in donor relationships because he was the primary donor. "I was making conversation," Damon replied evenly. "People at charity events often discuss the organization's work." Conversation. Victoria's voice rose with theatrical indignation. "You were conducting industrial espionage. You were gathering intelligence for whoever sent you here tonight." The room erupted in murmurs of shock and anger. These people had spent thousands of dollars to attend an exclusive charity gala, and now they were being told that their private conversations had been monitored by a corporate spy. The violation felt personal, immediate, and absolutely unforgivable. "That's enough." Thomas Whitmore stood up, his face flushed with anger. "I don't know who you're working for, but this is completely unacceptable. We're calling the police." "Already done," Victoria announced with satisfaction. "Security has been notified, and proper authorities are on their way. In the meantime, I think our uninvited guest should be detained until they arrive." Two large men in security uniforms, actual private security hired for the evening, moved toward Damon with the confident stride of people who knew they were on the right side of authority. The guests watched with the fascinated horror of people witnessing a car accident, their shock giving way to righteous indignation. "This is insane," Damon said, his voice cutting through the rising hysteria. "I'm not a spy. I'm not working for anyone. I'm here because I care about this Foundation's work." "Care?" Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "You care so much that you sneak into our private event under false pretenses. You care so much that you interrogate our donors and researchers. You care so much that you violate our trust and privacy." The accusations were building momentum, each one more inflammatory than the last. Victoria had found her rhythm, her voice rising with practiced emotion that played perfectly to her audience's preconceptions. She was giving them a villain they could understand, the outsider who'd invaded their sanctuary, the threat who'd violated their security. "I know who sent you," Victoria continued, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Our mysterious benefactor has been making increasingly unreasonable demands, questioning our every decision. When we refused to compromise our integrity, they sent you to spy on us." The narrative was perfect in its simplicity. The anonymous donor had become a shadowy antagonist, a faceless threat to the Foundation's mission. Damon had become their agent, a spy sent to gather intelligence for some unnamed corporate interest. Victoria had positioned herself as the defender of the Foundation's values, the leader who'd stood up to unreasonable demands and was now facing the consequences. Damon's voice cut through Victoria's performance like a knife. "Let me tell you about unreasonable demands." The room fell silent, shocked by the security guard's audacity in challenging Victoria's authority. But Damon had reached the breaking point. The accusations had gone too far, the lies had become too blatant, and the damage to the Foundation's mission had become too severe. Unreasonable demands like asking why research funding dropped by 60%, while administrative costs increased by 400%, Damon continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Unreasonable demands like wanting to know why promising research projects were canceled while consulting fees for your personal friends increased tenfold. Victoria's face went pale. How could you possibly know those numbers unless you're engaged in corporate espionage? Because those numbers came from the quarterly reports you filed with the state, Damon replied. Public documents that anyone can access. The only thing that requires espionage is finding out where the money actually went. The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Suddenly, the corporate spy narrative began to crumble, replaced by something far more threatening. To everyone present, if the Foundation's financial irregularities were bad enough to attract outside investigation, if the mismanagement was severe enough to require covert intelligence gathering, Victoria snarled, her composed mask finally slipping. "You're making wild accusations to cover your own illegal activities, am I?" Damon pulled out his phone, the small device suddenly looking like a weapon in his hands. "Because I have documentation. For every claim I've made, bank records, expenditure reports, canceled research projects, consulting contracts, all of it, obtained through perfectly legal channels." The room erupted in chaos as the implications sank in. If Damon had access to that level of financial information, if he could document the Foundation's expenditures in detail, then he wasn't just a security guard asking casual questions. He was someone with serious resources, serious connections, and serious evidence of wrongdoing. "This is ridiculous," Victoria shouted over the rising voices. "Are you going to believe some random security guard over the Foundation's leadership? Are you going to let this person destroy our organization with baseless accusations?" But the accusations weren't baseless, and everyone in the room was beginning to realize it. The numbers Damon had quoted were too specific, too accurate, too damning to be fabricated. The financial irregularities he described were too detailed, too systematic, too documented to be dismissed as wild conspiracy theories. "Who are you?" Dr. Chen's voice cut through the chaos, her scientific mind already working through the implications. "How do you have access to that information?" The question everyone was thinking but afraid to ask. The question that would change everything once it was answered. The question that would transform the evening from a charity gala into a reckoning that would reshape the Foundation's future. "My name is Damon Clark," he said quietly, his voice somehow carrying over the chaos. "Who's been funding your research?" The silence that followed Damon's revelation was absolute, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. Background music seemed to fade into insignificance. The name meant nothing to most of the guests, but the implication was staggering. "Clark?" Dr. Chen's voice broke the silence, her scientific mind making connections that others couldn't yet grasp, as in Clark Biotech, Clark Medical Research, Clark Foundation. The whispers started as recognition spread through the room like wildfire. Damon Clark wasn't just wealthy, he was one of the most successful biotechnology entrepreneurs in the world, a man whose companies had revolutionized medical research and whose personal fortune was estimated in the tens of billions. More importantly, he was known for his anonymous philanthropy, his insistence on supporting medical research without seeking public recognition. "You're the anonymous donor," Victoria breathed, her face cycling through shock, horror, and desperate calculation. "You're the one who's been ... funding this foundation for 7 years, Damon confirmed, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd finally stepped out of the shadows, providing over $200 million in research grants, facility improvements, and operational support, and watching it all be systematically diverted from its intended purpose. The room erupted in chaos as the implications hit everyone simultaneously. The security guard they'd been dismissing all evening. The man they'd treated like furniture. The person Victoria had just accused of corporate espionage was actually the Foundation's primary benefactor. The mysterious donor whose generosity had made everything possible. "This is impossible," Thomas Whitmore sputtered, his face red with embarrassment and panic. If you're actually, he couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't reconcile the security uniform with the revelation of who was wearing it. Actually what? Damon's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Actually someone who deserves basic respect. Actually someone whose questions about Foundation finances are legitimate rather than suspicious. Actually someone who has the right to know how his donations are being used. Victoria's composure cracked completely. You can't prove any of this. Anyone can claim to be a wealthy donor. Anyone can make accusations without evidence. You're right, Damon agreed, pulling out his phone. Anyone can make claims, but not everyone can provide documentation. He began reading from his screen, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned room. Wire transfer on January 15th of this year. $5 million designated for childhood leukemia research. Actual allocation, $500,000 to research. $4.5 million to administrative costs and consulting fees. Dr. Chen's face went white. That was my research. Grant, you told me it was canceled due to budget constraints. Budget constraints caused by creative accounting? Damon continued, his voice growing harder with each revelation. Wire transfer on March 8th, $3 million for facility improvements. Actual allocation, $200,000 for improvements. $2.8 million for management consulting provided by companies owned by board members' relatives. The accusations were devastating because they were specific, documented, and easily verifiable. Victoria had been caught not just embezzling funds, but lying about the reasons, manipulating the Foundation's mission to serve her personal interests while claiming to protect the organization from an unreasonable donor. You're destroying this Foundation, Victoria snarled, her mask of respectability finally discarded. You're sabotaging years of careful work with your obsessive need for control. I'm destroying it. Damon's voice rose for the first time, his anger finally breaking through his controlled facade. I'm not the one who fired the research staff to pay for consulting contracts. I'm not the one who canceled life-saving projects to fund personal expenses. I'm not the one who's been systematically looting an organization dedicated to helping children. The room was in complete chaos now, with guests shouting questions, board members demanding explanations, and Victoria's supporters trying to mount a defense that made less sense with each passing moment. But through it all, Dr. Chen's voice cut through the noise with scientific precision. The research could have been completed, she said, her voice shaking with controlled fury. The childhood leukemia treatment, we were months away from clinical trials. Children are dying while the funding sits in administrative accounts. Children are dying, Damon repeated, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority that no amount of wealth could buy, but that his genuine commitment had earned. Children are dying. While you debate whether my questions about missing research funding are appropriate dinner conversation, the accusation hit the room like a physical blow. These people had spent the evening celebrating their charitable giving, congratulating themselves on their generosity, while the very foundation they were supporting had been systematically betraying its mission. The children they claimed to care about had become abstractions, numbers, and reports. While the real work of saving lives had been sacrificed for personal gain, you have no right. Victoria's voice cracked with desperation. You can't just walk in here and destroy everything we've built. This foundation has helped thousands of children, has it? Damon's question was quiet, but devastating. Name one research breakthrough funded by this foundation in the past 2 years. Name one treatment that's moved from lab to clinical trials. Name one child whose life has been saved by the work you're so proud of. The silence that followed was damning. Victoria's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The other board members looked around desperately, searching for answers that didn't exist. The research had been canceled, the treatments had been shelved, and the breakthroughs had been sacrificed for administrative convenience. I can name several, Damon continued, his voice growing stronger. Dr. Chen's leukemia research, Dr. Martinez's work on pediatric heart disease, Dr. Patel's breakthrough in treating childhood diabetes, all canceled. all defunded, all abandoned, so you could increase your consulting fees and administrative salaries. Each name hit the room like a separate blow. These weren't abstract research projects, they were specific, promising treatments that could have saved lives. The guests were beginning to understand that their donations hadn't just been mismanaged. They'd been actively used to prevent the very work they'd intended to support. The facility model you've been celebrating tonight, Damon gestured toward the architectural display. It was designed 3 years ago. Construction should have started 18 months ago. But the funding was redirected to pay for this gala, for your salaries, for consulting contracts that produced nothing but invoices. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally, a desperate kind of fury that comes from being cornered with no escape route available. You're lying. You're manipulating these people with selective facts and emotional appeals. Damon pulled out a tablet, its screen displaying financial documents that made several board members visibly pale. Because I have the complete financial records for the past 3 years, every transaction, every transfer, every consulting fee, all of it documented, all of it traceable, all of it showing exactly where the money went. The tablet passed from hand to hand, the damning evidence spreading through the room like a virus. Each person who looked at the screen showed the same progression of expressions: confusion, recognition, horror, and finally, rage at being deceived. "This is forgery," Victoria declared, but her voice lacked conviction. "Financial documents can be fabricated. Anyone with enough resources can create false evidence." "You're right," Damon agreed. "That's why I didn't just rely on my own records. I've been working with federal investigators for the past 6 months, providing them with documentation of financial irregularities. Every transaction I've shown you tonight has been verified by forensic accountants." The revelation hit the room like a bomb. Federal investigators meant criminal charges, which meant potential jail time, which meant that everyone present could be implicated in a massive fraud case. The charity gala had become a crime scene, and the guests were realizing they might be witnesses rather than victims. Federal investigators. Thomas Whitmore's voice was barely a whisper. "You're saying this is a criminal matter?" "I'm saying that misappropriating charitable donations is a felony," Damon replied. "I'm saying that defrauding donors who believe their money is saving children's lives is a serious crime. I'm saying that the evidence is overwhelming, documented, and already in the hands of law enforcement." Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. "You bastard, you self-righteous, arrogant bastard. You think you can destroy people's lives just because you have money? You think you can play God with other people's careers and reputations? I think I can expect that when I donate money to save children's lives, it actually gets used to save children's lives," Damon replied, his voice cutting through her hysteria. "I think I can expect basic honesty from people who claim to share my values. I think I can expect that charitable organizations actually engage in charity." The moral authority in his voice was devastating because it was earned rather than assumed. He wasn't demanding respect because of his wealth, he was demanding accountability because of his commitment. The security uniform he wore had become irrelevant. What mattered was the evidence he carried and the lives that had been betrayed. "You want to know what's really criminal?" Damon continued, his voice rising with controlled anger. "It's not the money you stole. I can afford to lose $200 million. It's the children who died while you were deciding whether their lives were worth less than your consulting fees." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, just the exposure of financial corruption, but the moral reckoning that came with it. The Foundation's mission had been betrayed, its donors had been deceived, and its beneficiaries had been abandoned for personal gain. Those children didn't have to die. Dr. Chen's voice cut through the chaos, her scientific training giving her words devastating precision. The research was ready, the treatments were possible, the funding was available, but it was redirected to pay for galas like this one. The irony was perfect and terrible. The evening celebration had been funded by money that should have been used to save lives. The champagne and caviar had been purchased with funds intended for medical research. The orchestra and flowers had been paid for with donations meant to cure childhood diseases. "I want all of you to remember this moment," Damon said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I want you to remember that you were here when the truth came out, when the real cost of this corruption became clear. When you learned that your charitable giving had been turned into a criminal enterprise, the guests were beginning to understand that they weren't just witnesses to a scandal, they were participants in a crime scene. Their donations had been misappropriated, their trust had been betrayed, and their good intentions had been perverted into something monstrous. "This is over," Victoria declared, her voice shaking with rage and desperation. "Security, arrest this man. He's trespassing, he's making false accusations, and he's disrupting a private event." But the security guards weren't moving. They were staring at Damon with the recognition that comes from understanding that the power dynamics had shifted completely. He wasn't just a wealthy donor, he was the person who'd been funding everything, including their paychecks for the evening. "The only thing that's over," Damon replied quietly, "is your ability to steal money from children who need medical treatment. The only thing that's finished is your career in charitable management. The only thing that's ended is this foundation's tolerance for corruption." The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the chaos like a blade, their wailing growing louder as they approached the museum. Victoria's face went white as she realized that Damon hadn't been bluffing about law enforcement involvement. The federal investigators he'd mentioned weren't theoretical, they were actual agents who'd been building a case for months. "You can't do this," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising panic in the room. "You can't destroy everything we've built. This foundation has helped thousands of people, has it?" Damon's voice was quiet but devastating. "Because I've been tracking every dollar, every grant, every research project for the past 7 years. And what I've found is that this foundation has helped exactly one person, you." The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Victoria had positioned herself as the defender of the foundation's mission, the experienced leader who understood the complexities of charitable management. But the evidence was painting a very different picture, one of systematic embezzlement disguised as administrative necessity. "That's not true," Victoria protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "The overhead costs, the administrative expenses they're necessary for any large organization. You can't run a foundation without proper management." "Proper management?" Damon's laugh was bitter. "Is that what you call paying yourself $400,000 annually while research scientists make $45,000? Is that what you call spending $2 million on consulting fees for your brother's company while canceling childhood cancer research?" The specific numbers were devastating because they were accurate, documented, and easily verifiable. Victoria had been caught not just in general corruption, but in specific, quantifiable theft that had direct consequences for the children the foundation claimed to serve. "You don't understand the complexities," Victoria said desperately. "Running a foundation isn't like running a business. There are regulatory requirements, compliance issues, stakeholder management. Damon interrupted, his voice rising. "Is that what you call lying to donors about how their money is being used? Is that what you call telling researchers their projects are canceled due to budget constraints while you're approving 6-figure bonuses for yourself?" Dr. Chen stepped forward, her face pale with controlled fury. "You told me the leukemia research was canceled because the foundation couldn't afford to continue funding it. You said the donors weren't interested in long-term projects." "The donors," Victoria's voice cracked. "There's only one major donor, and he's been making impossible demands from the beginning. Unreasonable oversight, constant questioning, micromanagement of every decision. Micromanagement." Damon's voice cut through her protests like a knife. "Is that what you call asking for quarterly reports that actually show where the money went? Is that what you call requesting that research funding be used for research rather than administrative salaries?" The room was beginning to understand the full scope of the deception. Victoria hadn't just been embezzling, she'd been systematically portraying the foundation's primary benefactor as an unreasonable outsider, while using his donations to fund her own lifestyle. "You've been playing both sides, Thomas Whitmore," said his voice, shaking with realization. "You've been complaining about the anonymous donor's demands while stealing his money? You've been positioning yourself as the victim while you were actually the criminal." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "Criminal. I've devoted my life to this foundation. I've worked 18-hour days, sacrificed my personal relationships, dedicated everything to this organization. And you're calling me a criminal? Because I took reasonable compensation for my work." "Reasonable compensation?" Damon pulled out his tablet again, the screen displaying financial records that made several people gasp. You've paid yourself $1.2 million in salary and bonuses this year. You've approved $3.8 million in consulting fees for companies owned by your family members. You've spent $2.1 million on administrative expenses that include a luxury car, a corporate apartment, and travel that has nothing to do with foundation business. Each number was a separate blow, a specific example of how charitable donations had been converted into personal enrichment. The guests were beginning to understand that their generous contributions had been systematically looted by someone they'd trusted to manage the foundation's mission. Those expenses were approved by the board, Victoria said desperately. Every expenditure was properly documented and authorized. Authorized by a board that you control, Damon replied. A board that includes your brother, your former business partner, and 3 people whose companies receive consulting contracts from the foundation. You didn't just embezzle the money, you corrupted the entire governance structure to cover your tracks. The sirens were getting closer now, their wailing sound adding urgency to the already chaotic scene. Victoria's face was cycling through desperation, anger, and calculation as she realized that her carefully constructed defense was crumbling. Even if everything you're saying is true, she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone, destroying the foundation won't help anyone. The research projects, the facility construction, the ongoing programs, they'll all be canceled if you pursue this. The children who need help will suffer because of your vendetta. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated and might have been effective if the audience hadn't already seen the evidence of systematic corruption. But Damon's response was immediate and devastating. The research projects were already canceled, he said quietly. The facility construction was already stopped. The ongoing programs were already defunded. You've already destroyed the foundation's ability to help children. The only difference is that now everyone knows why. Dr. Chen's voice cut through the chaos with scientific precision. The childhood leukemia research could have saved dozens of lives by now. The heart disease treatment could have helped hundreds of children. The diabetes breakthrough could have changed the lives of thousands of families. All of that was sacrificed. So you could drive a luxury car and live in a corporate apartment. The moral weight of the accusation was staggering. These weren't abstract financial irregularities, they were specific decisions that had cost children their lives. The foundation's mission had been betrayed, not just in theory, but in practice, with real consequences for real people. I want you to understand something, Damon said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd finally stepped fully into the light. This isn't about money. I have more money than I can spend in several lifetimes. This isn't about control. I've been content to remain anonymous and let others manage the foundation's operations. He paused, looking around the room at faces that were finally showing him the respect that had been denied all evening. This is about trust, he continued. This is about the promise that when people donate money to save children's lives, that money actually gets used to save children's lives. This is about the basic honesty that should exist between people who claim to share the same values. The police sirens were almost at the museum now, their sound growing louder as federal agents prepared to make arrests that had been months in the planning. Victoria's face showed the recognition that her world was about to collapse, that the careful structure she'd built to hide her corruption was about to be exposed in the most public way possible. "You're destroying lives," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're ruining careers, ending relationships, devastating families." "I'm not destroying anything," Damon replied. "I'm revealing what was already destroyed. The foundation's mission was corrupted years ago. The research was canceled long before tonight. The children were betrayed the moment you decided their lives were worth less than your personal comfort." The sound of footsteps in the museum's marble hallways announced the arrival of federal agents, their presence transforming the charity gala into a crime scene. The guests were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not just the exposure of financial corruption, but the moral reckoning that comes when charitable giving is perverted into personal enrichment. "This is over," Victoria said, her voice shaking with defeat. "No," Damon replied, his voice carrying the weight of genuine commitment. "This is just beginning. The real work of saving children's lives starts now." 6 months later, Damon stood in the gleaming new laboratory that bore Dr. Chen's name. Watching her team prepare for the first clinical trial of their childhood leukemia treatment, the facility was everything the architectural model had promised: state-of-the-art equipment, comfortable family areas, and research spaces designed specifically for the work that would save lives. The first patient enrollment is scheduled for next week, Dr. Chen reported, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd been given a second chance to do the work she'd always been meant to do. We're projecting a 40% improvement in survival, rates possibly higher once we optimize the treatment protocols. Damon nodded, his satisfaction coming not from the recognition his name appeared nowhere in the facility, but from the knowledge that the work was finally being done. The Children's Medical Research Foundation had been completely restructured, with new leadership, transparent governance, and a board that included working researchers rather than administrative cronies. "What about the other projects?" he asked. Dr. Martinez's heart disease research is entering phase 2 trials next month, Dr. Chen replied. Dr. Patel's diabetes treatment is showing remarkable results in preliminary studies. The funding you provided has allowed us to restart everything that was canceled, plus initiate several new research directions. The funding had been $500 million in the past 6 months. Enough to not just restart the canceled research, but to establish endowments that would ensure the work continued, regardless of future administrative changes. Damon had learned from his mistake of trusting others to protect the Foundation's mission. Now, the mission was protected by legal structures that made corruption virtually impossible. "And Victoria," he asked, though he already knew the answer, "sentenced to 8 years in federal prison," Dr. Chen replied. Thomas Whitmore got 5 years. The other board members received various sentences, depending on their level of involvement. The restitution orders total almost $15 million, though most of that money is gone. The criminal consequences had been swift and severe once the federal investigation became public. The evidence Damon had provided was overwhelming, the financial irregularities were undeniable, and the moral weight of stealing from children's medical research had made the case a prosecutor's dream. More importantly, Dr. Chen continued, the new governance structure you established makes it impossible for this kind of corruption to happen again. Independent oversight, mandatory public reporting, board members who actually work in research, a model that other foundations are already adopting. That was the real victory, not just the punishment of those who'd betrayed the Foundation's mission, but the systematic changes that would prevent future betrayals, the transparency requirements, the governance reforms, the legal protections. For whistleblowers, all of it designed to ensure that charitable giving would actually serve charitable purposes. "Dr. Chen," Damon said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you. About that night at the Gala, when I was working security," she smiled, the expression carrying warmth and understanding. "You mean when you were gathering evidence while being treated like you were invisible?" "You knew, I suspected," she admitted. "The questions you were asking were too specific, too informed. And when you started reciting financial figures from memory, it became obvious that you weren't just a security guard asking casual questions." Damon laughed, the sound carrying relief and embarrassment in equal measure. "I thought I was being subtle." "You were being careful," Dr. Chen corrected, "but you were also being genuine. The anger you showed when you learned about the canceled research, the way you talked about the children who were suffering, that couldn't be faked." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small group of visitors' families whose children would be participating in the clinical trials. Damon watched as Dr. Chen explained the research, her passion for the work evident in every word. These were the people who mattered, the ones whose lives would be changed by the Foundation's actual mission rather than its administrative corruption. "Mr. Clark," a woman approached her young daughter holding her hand. "Dr. Chen told us about what you did, about how you saved the research that might save Emma's life." Damon knelt down to the girl's level, his voice gentle. "Dr. Chen is the one who's going to save your life, Emma. I just made sure she had the tools she needed to do her job," the girl smiled, with the resilience that children show even in the face of serious illness. "Thank you for making sure that doctors could help me. Thank you for being brave enough to help us learn how to help other children," Damon replied, as the families toured the facility. Damon found himself thinking about the evening that had changed everything, the charity gala that had become a crime scene, the security guard who'd revealed himself as a billionaire, the Foundation that had been destroyed in order to be saved. "Do you ever regret it?" Dr. Chen asked, joining him at the window overlooking the research floor, the public exposure, the loss of anonymity, the way it changed everything. Damon considered the question. His anonymous philanthropy had been comfortable, allowing him to support important work without the complications of public recognition. But that anonymity had also created vulnerabilities, allowing corruption to flourish in the shadows while he remained blissfully unaware. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that I trusted others to protect something I should have been monitoring myself. I regret that children died while I was assuming the best about people who were systematically betraying their trust. But you don't regret exposing the truth." "Never," Damon replied without hesitation. The truth was going to come out eventually. The only question was whether it would happen in time to save the research and the lives that depended on it. The research was not just saved, but expanded, with new projects launching regularly and promising treatments moving through the development pipeline. The facility had become a model for transparent, efficient, charitable operations, with every dollar tracked and every decision made in service of the mission, rather than personal enrichment. "You know," Dr. Chen said thoughtfully, that night at the gala, "when Victoria accused you of being a spy, she was actually right about one thing. That you were gathering intelligence. You were investigating. You were working undercover to expose corruption." She smiled. "You just weren't working for a competitor. You were working for the children. The children. That's what it had always been about, even when the adults had lost sight of the mission. The young patients who needed treatments that it didn't exist yet, the families who were desperate for hope, the researchers who were passionate about their work but couldn't continue without proper funding. The first patient in the leukemia trial," Damon said. "What are her chances?" "Better than they've ever been," Dr. Chen replied. "The treatment is showing remarkable promise, and we have the resources to optimize it properly. If everything goes as planned, she could be completely cured within 6 months. 6 months, the same amount of time that had passed since the gala, since the revelation, since the moment when everything had changed. It seemed fitting that the real measure of success would be counted in lives saved rather than money recovered or criminals punished. Dr. Chen Damon said, "I want you to know that this work, this facility, this mission, it's the most important thing I've ever done. Not the business success, not the financial achievements, but this. Giving you the tools to save children's lives." "You didn't just give us tools," she replied. "You gave us hope. You showed us that someone was willing to fight for the mission when everyone else was ready to compromise it. You proved that the work was worth protecting." As the sun set over the research facility, Damon reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The security guard who'd been dismissed at the door had become the Foundation's greatest advocate. The anonymous donor who'd been portrayed as unreasonable had become the champion of transparency and accountability. The man who'd been treated like he didn't belong had created a space where the most important work in the world could flourish. The gala had been about celebrating the Foundation's work while that work was being systematically destroyed. Celebration would come when the first child was cured, when the first family received good news instead of devastating diagnoses, when the research that had been canceled was finally allowed to fulfill its promise. "Thank you," Emma's mother said as they prepared to leave, her voice carrying the weight of parental desperation and hope. "Thank you for fighting for our children when we didn't even know they needed fighting for. Thank you for trusting us with something so precious," Damon replied. "We won't let you down." As the families left and the facility grew quiet, Damon stood alone in the laboratory that would soon begin saving lives. The security uniform was gone, replaced by the simple clothes of someone who no longer needed to hide his identity. The anonymous donor had become a public figure, but only in service of the mission he'd always supported. The gala had ended with arrests and scandal. But the real story was just beginning. The research would continue, the treatments would be developed, and the children would be saved. The Foundation's mission would be protected not by trust or good intentions, but by transparency and accountability that made corruption impossible. That was the true resolution, not the punishment of those who'd betrayed the mission, but the systematic protection of the mission itself. The security guard who'd been ignored at the door had become the guardian of something far more valuable than money or recognition. He'd become the protector of hope.